ми розпочинаємо.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we believe the last press briefing, and this is 3 strategies for Ukrainians' development in Ukraine. And Mr. Andriy Yermolaev, director of the Institute of Strategic Research in Ukraine, he will tell us about that work and its necessity, and then experts from the Institute will make comments and will speak about these 3 scenarios of development of Ukraine. I invite Andriy. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for your time to study our presentation. It's about a document which we often suggest for your attention. We have a printed version, and we'll have an electronic. It's called The Development of Political Economic Process in Ukraine 2014 and Strategy Building. And in this case, it's about short, long, mid-term prospects and scenarios. Before I give the floor to my colleagues, who will share the content and method that was used, and who offer their comments and descriptions of scenarios we considered, and let me tell you briefly about reasons, motivations that for this work, what is planned in the future. I have to say it's a pity that we have default of strategy built in our country. It covers everything. It concerns everything: economy and development of the state. Many times I gave this assessment, and we have an internal inflict. We have a crisis of statehood, which is on the edge of ruin. And part of the process is a civic conflict, and it has all the features of a civic war. And from the state, from groups, we see that civilians started to join paramilitary groups, and the conflict becomes not only professional, but it becomes ideologized, because a separatist movement has features of political subject. They have a problem of development of their own region, and as pseudo-state we built a political group that represents that position, and we are witnessing negotiation process. From the state, there are authorized people, but the fact of these negotiations, it shows that civic war and the conflict turned into a new phase. And the second important point is that this conflict becomes international. Not only by the nature of participants, because there are a lot of wild geese from many countries, but the change of behavior of geopolitical subjects is different. If until recently a civic war in Ukraine was considered a risk to security in the world, and they used the instruments of pressure on Russian Federation on the third party, which takes a practical unannounced part in the conflict. Today, how to resolve it. This is an issue of international negotiations, conditions, and proposals. And 2 last statements of Merkel as to one of the participants of this negotiating group. And today's information that there is an initiative which is supported by Merkel, and as to prolonging this period of peace. Some assessments of the situation. Now it's difficult to speak about some lineal variants of development of the country. We pass this period in the state of crisis of statehood and in the state of civic war. Under these conditions, it's important to understand that a lot of consequences and problems which we have in eastern regions are connected to the fact that we have a serious and internal conflict in the government. If until recently a key element of events in the east and in the west, there was an opposition between 2 political clans of old regime and new regime. Now we see the fact of in the new regime at least 3 political parties. The party of Hawks and Mr. Poroshenko, They support war and as a way to solve problems, and also there are pigeons and who think about peaceful solutions to preserve the state and to build a new country. And we have to say that there is one, the those who work for the interest of the third country. This and when there are they a lot of leaks of information and a lot of undermining activities. If we don't take that into consideration, that does not allow to plan at least for midterm activity in security sector and in politics in general. That's why the first conclusion is principle. In addition to important steps related to prolonging negotiations with a separatist in order to find some kind of formula to stop the war by itself. And in addition to those tasks on the foreign arena, political arena, and to prepare and sign the agreement on free trade area, it's critically important to recharge the executive branch, up to the next parliamentary elections, which should be balanced, depoliticized, and the most important, it should be built for the party of pigeons, because internal intrigue, absence of clear cooperation between different groups in power brings to the fact that Ukraine, is losing our statehood, and there's a threat of further destabilization. We should develop the system of, we should develop an anti-crisis program. The president announced only a general direction, but anti-crisis program is not a program after, but this is a program for today and now, with the involvement of all institutions, humanitarian, social, food supplies, necessary supplies to all population, security of existing infrastructure on that territory which is under control of the state and law enforcement bodies. That is critically important because there is a threat of a humanitarian catastrophe. Let's look at the factors. There's a new stage of undermining activity, and that includes technogenic terrorism, and there's a threat for harvest. Internal market is destroyed, and its infrastructure, I mean consumers market and social services, like healthcare services, and under such conditions, absence of program of the cabinet or ministers and executive structures locally, maybe maximal elements of security that undermines not only trust but also a wish of population to think about cooperation with the central power. That's the issue of national security, because in surrogate compensations from different parties, from separatists even, can undermine influence on the situation in the region. And the second point, I will just outline. That's the task for all of us. The issue of vision of further development and resolution of Eastern Asia, because there's a threat that territory will become a new subject. It's not enough to reform only self-governance, and even consultations show about that. The problem is that variant will it be imposed from abroad, from Russia, or from all the new leaders of separatists, or that variant will be prepared and realized by Kiev and national authorities. For scenarios and comments, I would like to give the floor to my advisor, Mr. Klemenko. Mrs. Klemenko. Our institute prepared scenarios of development of social-economic situation in Ukraine, and I would like to tell you briefly why We used such a method to analyze the situation, and because it is changing very quickly, and we hardly can assess and analyze those factors which came up every day. That's why we tried to step back from what we have at present and from facts, and to focus on identifying the main reasons in Ukraine that have influence in Ukraine, and how we should prognose how they can develop and what kind of situation we could have. We singled out three scenarios: a basic scenario, as we call it, autocratic, conservative, stabilization. It's an optimistic scenario. It's a scenario the best when everything with all the factors, and a pessimistic scenario. The crisis is going on. Among main factors we analyzed, we took first of all the conflict, how that conflict would develop, and what internal reasons will move it. Will it become professional? Will it turn into a professional conflict when participants become interested in the conflict to continue? Another factor, the factor of to which extent the Ukrainian Ukrainian government can respond to challenges. The third factor, the factor of Russia. We understand that because Russia has interest in Ukraine, and that's why we have this situation with military conflict abroad. That's why the factor of Russia is very important, and our relations between Ukraine and international community, mostly with partners countries, with the U.S., European Union. We can say that factor was very important when there was a process of change in the government in Ukraine. The country was on the edge of default, and but they saved macro financial stability, but at the same the part of our territory was annexed. Now I would like to speak about the first scenario briefly. The main driver of this scenario is an ability of Ukrainian government to influence on the situation and to respond adequately to challenges. But what is the corridor of opportunities for such a reaction? In our view, it can be a search for internal consensus and political compromise. The new president was elected. There's a high demand of the society to peace and changes, to reforms. The society supported the position of the president with his program of reforms. At the same time, the society is very interested for the conflict to be stopped as soon as possible, for the peace to come to Ukraine. And we understand that in some sense these are two colliding requests. That's why the corridor of opportunities is not broad. We believe that under such scenario, the president could rely on broader political consensus, but the payment for that consensus, very short reforms, those reforms which are in demand and which are possible under this political consensus. We believe that under this scenario, Ukraine will preserve strategic partnership relations with EU countries and with those countries from which Ukraine gets support, and also we will preserve macro financial stability, because that support of Western partners will allow to have more room for maneuvers. What can be a risk of this scenario? If the situation gets worse in the east, attention of the government can move from a compromise to getting deeper into that military armed opposition, so they can lose control on a very important sphere of life, of very important spheres of life. And if we lose that control, then they can lose control over political process, and there could be a new wave of political opposition, and reforms could stop. We could go back to that conflict inside of the society, which motivated these changes. Under an optimistic scenario, we call it utopic, because this scenario is based on the belief that a conflict can be localized very soon and can be solved politically. So military armed conflict stops, and they start negotiations, and they look for a model of political regulation, on the eastern issue. But it's very important under this scenario that Ukraine gets prospect for quick integration into a European community. That will be an economic integration, first of all, and there could be even the goal could be to integrate into big projects, and that will be a driver to renovate growth in Ukraine in a short period, maybe even next year, because it will be very difficult to bring back growth. We believe that next year it will not happen. What is the window of opportunities for that scenario? First of all, realization of demand for social renovation of the country. Why do we believe that that will not happen in a short prospect? Because that causes conflict. And now Ukrainian government doesn't have that resource of consensus in the society. It doesn't have the majority in internal political processes to hope that reforms would work. Because even in the government, there are a lot of conflicting points, and they are an obstacle for reforms, and especially for reforms that are inevitable. What is the risk of this scenario? If the armed conflict in the east will aggravate, and we think that success of Ukraine will cause resistance of initiator of our problems, and that is Russian Federation. So that will be a big obstacle to realize this scenario. And pessimistic scenario. This scenario is if Ukraine plunges into a crisis, which has an epicenter in the east, on a small territory approximately, compared to the way it is imagined in public opinion. Because geographically, it's not a big territory, but instability it generates is growing goes to neighboring regions, and it can grow to those regions where it's peaceful today. We'll not forget that there is a great idea of Novorossiya, New Russia, and they mean to unite Ukrainian regions so they can put on fire if the central government doesn't have enough of political will, institutional capacity, and if political conflict will come to the phase of internal opposition. Under this scenario, if the situation in the east aggravates, and if the conflict spreads to other regions, it seems to us that the window of opportunities is focused on efforts to develop a security sector, to renew it. This is something which is done. If when we joined the conflict, we didn't have security service. Our internal forces of police and interior forces, they were in big trouble. And if 10% from their numbers existed, we could not fight back during the first stage of that conflict. So it seems to us that under the condition of a bigger conflict, people have to survive. And that is the last hope, to keep the country together as a subject of an international law. Under such a scenario, we believe that we will have support of Western partners, but that support will be limited by minimum. Just keeping country from a chaos, but institutional, economic, and structural reforms in economy, it will be postponed until the conflict is local, and until they decide on which territory they could run these reforms. As a risk, we can lose our statehood, and the Ukraine can split into several new subjects. Under such scenario, there is a threat of a new political and economic crisis, and with new tests in society, because it seems to me that the society that went through Maidan has an instrument to stand for its interests. If we don't find answers in political dimension, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Volodymyr Lopatyu. Good afternoon. We introduced 3 scenarios of possible development of Ukraine, but I would like to tell you that there is one systemic risk which in any case will influence on policy of Ukraine and on political leadership of Ukraine. The risk is related to the fact that Ukraine inherited a certain model of management, a vertical, which uses the principle: what is not allowed, that is prohibited. It means that this is a vertical which is not able to act, and there are too many tasks. And unfortunately, the main risk I formulate that until postponement of reforms until the situation settles, and we hear that reforms and international partners who support them, they believe this linear logic: let's solve the conflict in eastern regions of Ukraine, that will begin reforms. The Prime Minister also says that, the Prime Minister of Germany, Merkel, she says the solvement of problems in Donbass will open the road for reforms in Ukraine. In our opinion, it's a completely wrong perception of the situation, because we suggest to look at differently on the situation. Our formal sense, as long as Ukraine doesn't begin systemic reforms, it will not be able to resolve that crisis, to localize armed conflict in the east. It will not be able to finish ATO and to turn to a political solution, and it cannot achieve peace and stability. From where do we have it? You see, for the majority of experts who it's clear that a crisis in it will not be over, not today, not in a week, not in a month. That region gets into a special regime of function for long. That's why to believe that we will begin the reforms when it is resolved, it means that we have to postpone the reforms. We speak about something different, that for the president, every day there should be 4 maps on his table, which it's like playing at the same time. When there is a task, what should be done in every macro region, and he gets summaries, whether we do or not, whether we develop or not. The first area, the region of ATO, Lugansk and Donetsk region, which is not under control. In fact, it's about one third of that territory, because 2/3 are not under control of illegal armed groups. The second, those buffer regions, and our moral potential depends on that. If we can guarantee that instability and armed conflicts cannot spread to Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa regions, if we came to the format of a new political regulation, if we have a consensus and people are at the table and look for the variants, how to renew strategies of regional development of these regions and how to provide stability, then we have arguments to speak about. LTO. If we don't close those risks, then operators, separatists, they built a strategy which means to spread instability to buffer zones. The third macro region, that is the central Ukraine and western Ukraine, those regions where people passed through revolution of dignity and which require systemic reforms today. So these regions are ready to have a roadmap of changes, including reform of local self-governance, etc., without waiting for changes in the constitution. Because we understand that the constitutional process to have reform of local self-governance, at least, and to provide powers to cities that are ready for local self-governance. 20. We don't need changes for into the constitution that can be done on the level of the cities of the government. We should raise an issue about decentralization. And we should not wait until we solve something global here. And finally, there is one more zone, which we must remember, that is Crimea. Because Ukraine, we see that in Ukraine, Crimean, then nobody speaks about Crimea anymore, but we should demand that is an illegally annexed territory, and we should look for mechanisms to find partners but to provide rights of citizens of Ukraine there, including our economic interests in Crimea. So in fact, this is an hour of simultaneous plan, and it means that we should overcome managerial crisis when all resources was thrown into only in one direction. That's a key challenge. Uh, It will influence on the rest of our scenarios. If we don't move to that scenario, that will be a big weight which will pull us into a pessimistic scenario. Thank you. Colleagues, questions, please. The scenarios allow us to see different versions for the future and come out from the experience we have and from what we can do and depending on our motivation. If we think and analyze every scenario, that will make us to think about an optimistic scenario, but at the same time I'd like to finish pessimistically, not from the point of view of existing models and proposals, how we can organize the work, but also there are three more problems. A humanitarian catastrophe. It was a scarecrow they used in forums and in the UN. Now it's an awful reality because it's about the people get impoverished and there are first signs of when people start suffering, etc., etc. So that's reality which is growing, and its peak can be in the autumn. We have to deal with industrial regions, and now there's still about 3 million people are still working. Just imagine that at the background of those events, it's not easy to stop. They will stop enterprises, and the situation will get worse. There could be preconditions that a humanitarian problem can turn into social revolution, which will be completely different as to moods of people. If we understand that in June, our duty is not only to work with issues of humanitarian issue, but also to look for a way to mind our people, to mobilize them who are ready for peaceful life, who don't want to be revolutionaries. So it will be very important how it is the association agreement is signed tomorrow. It's a part of reforms we need to have, but signing the agreement with the EU that's a long corridor during which we have to reform the country and we have to reform institutions and trade regimes, etc. And we have to understand that that part of population of industrial regions who during this time just don't hear a signal what can happen in their life. So that European choice which is realized in these steps, until now it is not realized in practical projects or changes in life of industrial regions and of areas, and which can prove that if you become a part of a big European ceremony and economy, that means that has a lot of requirements that I believe that the EU will not be able in the near future to offer anything else than financial assistance, which is important, but it's not that is not sufficient. So we have to think maybe this is a task for experts, for our diplomats, and who believe that they are. Ukraine needs a Marshall Plan, but not in a sense of new financial assistance, and we have to speak to technologically developed countries. We should bring leading companies, those industries which are important for regions, and we should overcome that cultural and ideological conflict, and it's very important from the point of European choice, like practically efficient and perspective. The second stage of the free trade zone, which should be formulated as a new Ukrainian initiative. Thank you very much, and I invite you to questions. Japanese company. Let me ask the question in Russian. I just about signing the association agreement with the EU, which will take place tomorrow. My question is, why? I understand it's very important for Ukraine, but why? Why? Well, we have. Well, is it not? Why is it not? Why is it impossible to speak to Russia now during the conflict in the East? I have to remind to you that signing this agreement was we were preparing it since 2008. So in 2011 we had a ready text. One more year we spent for the text to be agreed in terms of translation, vocabulary. It was ready by the end of the 2012, and then it was suspended. Now we understand why. Probably they were not going to sign it. But relations with the EU, how they are reflected in association agreements that are very important, because Ukraine was had always had an open economy. This is not a big economy to build relations with all the world. We as a country, we're not interested that some relations suffer because of some others, but because in our country, social conflict, civilization conflict, we understand that part of people in eastern Ukraine, they live in the old system, and this is a clash of cultures, politics, and so we should not postpone signing the agreement with the EU. That is the choice of Ukrainian people. At the background, with the conflict at the background, there was a serious risk that the conflict could undermine the negotiation process between Ukraine and EU, because after we signed a political association, there were new risks in Ukraine, which were risks for Europe, and a big role was played by the will of EU. They are readiness to sign, and they don't want to debate Ukraine issue anymore. So Europe is ready to participate in Ukrainian reforms as a party that takes responsibility on itself for the market, and that will allow us to move faster and to pass legislation, and that opens the room for investments, and also we influence on plans of that part of those Ukrainian politicians, including separatists, who thought that this process will stop. And after it is signed, such play will be impossible. Hello. Murat Mamuli, Kazakhstan Institute of Strategic Research and Doctor of Political Sciences, but I represent the mission of Special Monitoring Mission, OSCE, in Ukraine. I have a lot of questions to what is happening in Ukraine. I will try to focus them, to bring them together. Come, come to be our guest, and we will share all the documents. Okay? As I understand, the conflict in the East has a regional nature. It's something like we had in Tajikistan in 1993. So people are one nation, not divided by clans. Start a conflict. Don't you think that events in if you speak about the industrial region, that the conflict can become a class conflict? So it will move. They will move it into a new dimension. There are a lot of questions in what will be signed tomorrow in Brussels, economic part of association, which because it's opens the road to industrialization of your country, and that will cause a lot of reduction in those industries. So it will encourage the conflict. The East, the past is bad. Old and Ukraine. West, is it future Ukraine? And when I concluded, I answered this sentence: the risk of that, the risk in that it can turn into a social process. Even during Maidan protest or Maidan, there was a national, democratic, and social issue. None of them was answered after we stopped that Maidan period because of different reasons. Civic conflicts are inspired this situation. Social contradictions, especially in industrial regions, impoverishment, all the principles begin working completely. So the question is how to prevent the crisis and armed crisis, and how not to have a class problem, because the difference between rich and the rest is very big, and that risk will grow if not to do anything now. And the second point, nobody considered that this association agreement is like manna from heaven for enterprises. These are just better rules for the development of market economy than rules they have in the custom union. As far as I know, Kazakhstan refused. Not everything is realized. Free trade area with EU and better cooperation with highly technological partners, but this does number two, and we will ask the authorities to think about this. Technological companies should be brought. It allows us to modernize the country, which is otherwise it's impossible. It's a big problem for Russian Federation that when they get into a Ukrainian conflict, they lose trust and credibility, and that capital cannot go into Russian economy. They lose capital, but they also lose credibility because to use Soviet model like raw materials, science and their own production under these conditions, under global distribution label, that's an old approach. So we know about shortcomings that we have. A free trade area is not a manner. We will get risks, but if we take the second step quickly, if we develop our military industry and space industry, we have a new industrial policy which we didn't have. We get a chance because they will trust more, and we will be taken as a part of Europe, and as a new advantage. I would like to give the floor to my colleagues. the association agreement has advantages and disadvantages. It will depend whether Ukraine can use that and whether we can minimize risks. The customs union and would stop some reforms. It's very important for us to move from old technology, and we should have initiatives, etc., etc. So this circle and team recently worked. There was only one scheme which worked, like expert based on raw materials, and now we could join European programs and culture, information programs, and they have a lot of other components. And so, of course, we'll have losses because of free trade zone area, but to the big extent, that is considered statistically that we will close the market of CIS, and that's it. But sooner or later, it's possible to diversify, and companies should work on that, and the government also should offer a mobilizing program to find new markets. Are there any other questions? So the last question from me, if I may, as a moderator. You did a lot of work. These three scenarios with conditions, risks. Those who take decision, do they have them this scenario on their tables? The president, for example. We distribute this document. We were not in a hurry. We decided to make it public, so this document will be everywhere. But right away, I would like to say that it's not the first document which is focused at variants how to solve a crisis. We started our activity with the development of the program of a national dialogue, and until now, we believe that if in March there were conditions for new political agreement for smarter approach how to build the pole, we would have a different. Russian Federation would not be able to use those contradictions we are discussing now. So how we had a program, a road to peace during in Crimean crisis, but some elements of that plan, we hear that from the president, and we're happy that our approaches coincide, but we lost our time. Now we propose that very soon we prepare and we will offer anti-crisis program like on key issues. And the second point, we'll work seriously on the issue how to develop the East. If Kiev and Kiev intellectuals, together with our colleagues, if we don't find that moral, if politicians don't do that, they will offer that from the East, from a side. And it's a crime. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Welcome to our center with new scenarios.